Spiritual awakening. It's a concept you find out there, especially on YouTube. You can find a lot of videos to talk about spiritual awakening, what it is, what it does for you, what happens afterwards, the signs that you're spiritually awakened, or the things that will happen to you after awakening, and all these kinds of videos. Now, I haven't really talked about awakening before because I was quite frankly confused about what people mean about it, because as I've said about non-duality, you can find videos that approach it from different angles and they don't always agree with each other. So I was not quite sure what exactly is a spiritual awakening. And so I was watching today a video by a man named J. Stuart Dixon. He has a channel called Spirituality for Badasses. And the title of the video was The Scam of Non-duality. And in the article, he was making some really good points about awakening. And he was also referencing an article by a man called Scott Killerby, who used to be a non-dual teacher, but came to see the limitations of the non-dual approach, quit teaching for 5 years until he's now teaching from a higher perspective. And what both of them said was that, first of all, they had personally interacted with a number of these non-dual teachers. And they had both had a valuable experience from the non-dual teachings of shifting their perspective. But the reason why they call non-duality a scam is that most non-dual teachers talk about that the goal is the spiritual awakening. And they present the spiritual awakening as if it's some kind of final event, and after that there's no suffering. It's the end of suffering when you are awakened. And they describe in different ways. Some say you no longer have a self, some say you no longer identify with your thoughts or whatever, but they all portray it as something final. And what both J. Stuart Dixon and Scott Killerby described was that they experienced themselves that this promise didn't hold. They had an awakening process, or an awakening experience, but they still had suffering. They still had the psychological issues. Basically, their psychology didn't go away. Now, Stuart Dixon presents it this way. He says, the non-dual teachers are saying, normally you have the ego out front and your authentic awareness is behind. But when you have a spiritual awakening, it switches. So now your authentic self is in front, and the ego not only goes behind, it actually goes away. But what he had experienced himself was that the ego was still there. And you shift between the awakened experience and the ego experience. And Scott Killerby described the same thing. And this is, of course, what I've been saying in my non-duality videos. So what that did for me when I read the article and watched the video was that it kind of crystallized for me what is the underlying promise that's being made by many non-dual teachers in regard to awakening. Namely, awakening is a final experience that ends your suffering. And it's just a switch of the mind. And by switching the mind, however they describe it, you're not suffering anymore. And this is, of course, is something that I've said in several videos. It just isn't realistic. It just can't happen. But I'd like to explain why it can't happen based on the teachings I've given in my other non-duality videos. Because for those who are willing to stop chasing an empty promise, but actually engage in a process that will produce results, this can be helpful. So I have to give you a little bit of a different model of the psyche based on the teachings I've given. I'll just give you a short summary here, but you have to bear with me because I can't explain why non-duality is a scam or why spiritual teachers are lying to you about awakening unless you understand this. So what I have explained in several of my videos, including my video about how the world was created, is beyond this world that we see, which is made up of energy that vibrates within a certain frequency spectrum. Beyond this world is what I call the spiritual realm. This is higher energies of a higher vibration. In the spiritual realm, there is your spiritual self, your higher self, your authentic self, which I call the I Am Presence. This is an individual being, very complex individuality. And it resides in the spiritual realm, and the purpose of the existence of the I Am Presence is to expand its individuality and grow towards higher and higher levels of consciousness. And as a part of this process of growing, there was a point where the I Am Presence decided it wanted to experience what it's like to embody in our world, this world, planet Earth, with the density of the energies that make up the physical universe. It wanted to experience what it was like, it wanted to experience what it is to act, to co-create. But the I Am Presence is so complex, it couldn't descend in its totality, so it sent an extension of itself, which I call the conscious you. I know this is a theoretical concept for many people if you're new to it, but it actually has great explanatory power. So you see, the conscious you is an extension of the I Am Presence, which is a spiritual being. And why that's important is that there's nothing in this material world that defines the I Am Presence. The I Am Presence is beyond, it's independent of anything in the material world. This is part of why the I Am Presence can't descend in its fullness. So it sends the conscious you, which takes embodiment on earth. But in order to take embodiment, the conscious you has to go through a process, because there are actually 4 levels of the material universe. The highest energies is the identity realm, then there's the mental, the emotional, and then the physical, the level of the physical body. So in order to interact with the physical body, the conscious you has to create structures in the identity mind, how it sees itself in relation to Earth. Basically, you have to come to the point where you can accept that you are a human being living in a dense human body. Then at the mental level, you create other structures that relate to what you think you can do and can't do in this physical realm. And then you have the emotional level where you create various emotional patterns, and these are what makes you actually take action. You formulate the desire to take action at the identity level, make it more concrete at the mental, but then you act on it through the emotions. That's what gives you the impetus to actually do something. So the reason why this is important is that in order to interact with this dense physical body, the conscious you takes on this sense of identity, the thoughts and the feelings. It's like you can say that taking embodiment on earth is like going into a theater where you are deciding you want to play a certain role. Therefore, you take on the costume, you put on makeup, you learn the lines that this role is supposed to say. And now the conscious you is inside of this role, and it's experiencing life through the perception filter of these structures at the 3 higher levels of the mind, and even the physical level. But the conscious you, and this is why it's an important concept to have, the conscious you hasn't been changed by taking this on. Just as an actor goes into a theater and puts on the costume, isn't changed. And when the play is over, the actor takes off the costume and the makeup and returns to his normal state of mind. And this is the potential that the conscious you has. So think about it this way. When you look at human beings and yourself, we have 2 fundamentally different states of consciousness we can be in. And this is what explains the millions of people throughout history who had these mystical experiences or awakening experiences or whatever people have called them. Because if you look at humanity today, 99.99999, add as many decimals as you want, % of the people identified with the structures in their identity, mental and emotional minds. Some people are more acting on their feelings, other people are more intellectual, some people have a clear sense of identity, so they can be focused at different levels. But most people are completely identified with this structure that the conscious you created in order to interact with the physical body and act in the material realm. But the conscious you hasn't been changed by going into the structure, which means that at any moment, the conscious you could step outside of the structure, outside of the outer identity, thoughts and feelings and physical body, and experience. I'm not talking about theory here. I'm talking about the conscious you can have an actual experience. I am not this. I am not the physical body. I'm not these emotions. I'm not these thoughts. I'm not even this deeper sense of identity as a human being living in a particular country and blah, blah, blah. And throughout history, millions of people have had these experiences. It can happen spontaneously. It can happen in life-threatening situations. It can happen as a result of a slow, gradual, conscious process of following a spiritual path, questioning your sense of identity. Who am I? What kind of being am I? What kind of patterns do I have? Am I this? Am I that? So it can happen in various ways. But all I'm saying is, millions of people have had these experiences. Throughout the ages, they have been called different things. And here is the essence of this. Most people are completely identified. They are born, they grow up, they take on a certain identity in their family, their country, their culture, their religion, whatever, and they're completely identified with this. Suddenly, at a certain age, for most people in adulthood, but for some people in childhood, they have one of these experiences of going outside of all of this. And the experience of going outside of it is so dramatically different that you have to find a way to explain it. You have to find a way to deal with it. Here is the problem with that. What I explain in several of my videos is that when we first descend into embodiment, we descend to a certain level of consciousness where we have an intuitive sense that we are still connected to our higher self. We are connected to something outside our own minds. Our minds are not closed systems. And we can go two ways from that point. We can either expand that sense of connection whereby we rise higher in consciousness, in levels of awareness, expanding our sense of connection until we attain a sense of oneness with a higher self. Or we can go below that starting level and go into what I call the illusion of separation, where we use the duality consciousness to create a new sense of identity, where we don't see ourselves as connected beings, we see ourselves as separate beings. This means we now create new structures at the identity, mental, and emotional level, where we see ourselves as a separate being rather than being connected to something outside our own minds. We believe, as I explained in several of my non-duality videos, our minds become a closed system because the duality consciousness makes us think that we are able to define what's real and unreal, what's true and false. We are defining how the world should work. And so, still, even if we create these separate structures, which again, 99.99% of the people on earth have done in past lifetimes, even if we create these structures as separate beings, the conscious you isn't changed by it. It can still step outside and have a spiritual, mystical, intuitive, non-dual experience. The problem is, what happens when the experience subsides and you are back in your normal life having to deal with the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune that we all have to deal with? Well, the big question here is, do you realize the fundamental reality of the situation? Do you realize that this different experience, this intuitive experience, is meant to serve as your frame of reference that makes you question the worldview you have as a separate being? This doesn't mean that this happens all at once, but it does mean that you now have a frame of reference, that there's something outside of your normal state of consciousness as a separate being based on the duality consciousness. And you can use that to systematically, gradually question the illusions that made you think, that made you convinced that you are a separate being. So this is one way. This is the purpose of these experiences. But what happens to many people is that they now use the worldview they created as separate beings to try to explain that experience that is beyond separation. They, so to speak, pull the experience into the separate mind and use the duality consciousness to try and experience it, or to try and explain it. That's why I say over and over again in my non-duality videos that if you don't understand the duality consciousness, you can't actually grasp what non-duality is, because non-duality is non-duality. And if you don't understand duality, you can't grasp non-duality. Okay, so back to what Stuart Dixon and Scott Killerby said. They had experienced themselves that after you have a so-called awakening experience, you still have the same psychology that you had before. And they actually both described that they interacted with a number of these non-dual teachers, and most of these non-dual teachers have the same experience. They also experience that they still have their psychological issues. But this is not talked about publicly. So in other words, there's a public facade that you can have an awakening experience. And this is it. You're ego-free. You're home-free. But nobody has that experience. It's just a matter of that most non-dual teachers aren't willing to talk about this. And why is that? Well, Killerby mentions that he thinks that some people are ashamed because they feel that when you are a spiritual teacher, when you have gained a following or reputation as a spiritual teacher, you're supposed to be perfect. So if you're not, you're so ashamed that they're afraid to talk about it. I think it also has to do with the mechanics of the marketplace. That if you promise people that a spiritual awakening is the end of their suffering, and then you yourself are still suffering, then if you admit that, you're going to undermine your whole sales point that attracted people to you. And this touches upon one of the big issues, I've talked about this in several videos, is the difference between what I call the outer path and the inner path. And the outer path goes back to religions. It goes back thousands of years. You can take Christianity, for example. Jesus, when you look at his teachings, Jesus was a non-dual teacher who actually taught a path to a higher state of consciousness. How? Look at the beam in your own eye, which is, in the vernacular that could be used 2,000 years ago, meaning your psychology. Look at your psychology. Resolve your psychology. What is your psychology? It's what I just explained. It's the structures that the conscious you created in the identity mind, the mental mind, the emotional mind. That's your unresolved psychology. I call them subconscious selves or separate selves, because they are structures based on an illusion, but they're also endowed with a certain energy and consciousness, so they resist you letting go of them. But the only way to really grow is to see these structures, see the illusion, and consciously let them go. And this requires work, because the ego, or the selves that make up the ego, they will resist you trying to look at them. They want to stay hidden because that's how they can control you and get your energy, and that's the only way they can survive. So the fact of the matter is that there is a tremendous resistance in your own subconscious mind to you looking at the subconscious mind and resolving the things that keep you tied to the subconscious mind. So what I'm explaining in a number of my videos is that the inner path is that you look at this, you look at yourself and you consciously resolve it. In contrast to that is the outer path, where you are promised that you don't have to look at your subconscious mind. You just have to go through some outer change, and then you will be changed without having to look at yourself. This is what Christianity started promising with the advent of the Catholic Church. You believe in the church, you take the sacraments, you follow the dictates of the outer church and the priesthood, and you are guaranteed to be saved after this lifetime. Complete lie, complete fiction. But now you go to today. And I have seen for the 48 years I've been on the spiritual path that there are spiritual teachers, whether they're non-dual teachers or other kinds of spiritual teachers, who are making that promise. You follow me, you are loyal to me, you stay in my organization, here in our little community, in our little ashram, you practice the practice, you do what I tell you to do, and you are guaranteed to be enlightened, awakened, or whatever happens. Some of these non-dual teachers, you listen to me, you seek to switch your mind as I'm telling you to do, you will have an awakening experience, and that'll be the end of your suffering. Why is this a lie? Well, I just explained why. The conscious you is normally identified with the structures in the identity, mental, and emotional minds. When you have an awakening experience, as most people, as far as I can see, define it, it's an experience where the conscious you is stepping outside of those structures. And this can be more or less dramatic. For some people it's not that dramatic, they hardly notice it. For other people it's a really dramatic thing. And my personal sense of it is that the more people are identified with the outer mind, the more dramatic the experience will be. Because it's like people have grown up in a dark room where they are used to fumbling around in the dark and feeling everything that's in the room. And all of a sudden, they're taken outside the dark room and they're blinded by the sun, and it's a very dramatic experience. But the problem is, of course, that it isn't permanent. The conscious you steps outside of the structures in the subconscious mind. But the structures are still there. How could they not be? You created these structures. This is the power of this model I've given you. That, as I said, the I Am Presence wanted to have certain experiences on earth. And in order to have those experiences, the conscious you created the structures in your identity, mental, and emotional mind. Then, when the conscious you decided to go into separation, it created other structures to get other experiences that you can only have as a separate being. But nevertheless, you, the conscious you, created these structures to have a particular experience. In order to be free of these structures, you have to, number one, decide you've had enough of this experience, you don't want it anymore. And then you have to be willing to look at what was the illusion that caused you to create this self. You also have to deal with the energy that has been accumulated in the self by invoking spiritual light to transform the energy. And then, when you come to see the illusion and consciously let it go, the self dies. And then you are free of that self, not some of the others. But if you are willing to go through the process of looking at these selves one at a time, you can make permanent progress. But in order to do that, you have to give up this illusion that your awakening experience, no matter how dramatic it seemed, was the end of the road, the end of suffering, and that you have now permanently shifted. What you have an opportunity to do is to make a permanent shift where you realize and accept you are more than the structures in your mind. And therefore, because you experience you are more, you can stop identifying with the structures. You can look at them one at a time with the knowledge that I am not this separate self. And therefore, I can look at it, I can do what I need to do to transform the energy, I can see the illusion behind it, and I can consciously decide to let the self go, to let it die. As I've explained in many of my videos, these selves often present you with a problem that you have to solve. But you have to come to the point where you decide, I don't want to solve the problem. I just want to let the self die. I explained this in several videos, so you can find this if you're interested in it. But the power of this model, explanatory power of this model, is that it explains what many people call an awakening experience. And it gives you a path, step-by-step, systematic path for permanently escaping the ego, the separate selves that cause your suffering. Meaning you can actually, and this is one of the questions that Scott Killerby mentioned in his article that drove him, is it possible to live on Earth without suffering? Well, yes, but only if you overcome these separate selves in your subconscious mind, because it is through those separate selves that you are experiencing suffering. Let me rephrase that. In reality, there is no suffering in terms of an objective condition outside yourself. Now, I know many people will object to this because they'll say, well, I'm suffering because I'm alone and I don't have any money. Yes, but it's not the fact that you are alone and don't have money that causes you to suffer. It's the structure in your own mind that causes you to experience this outer situation as suffering. And this is the subconscious selves I'm talking about. So in other words, the conscious you steps into a particular self, and through the perception filter of that self, you are experiencing a particular situation as suffering. But if you step outside of that self, you're just in pure awareness or neutral awareness, you don't experience that situation as suffering. It's just a situation that can happen on Earth, but you are not defined by it. You are not a human being. You are a spiritual being. And therefore, when you realize this, you can say, okay, so why is it that now I'm out here, I don't experience this as suffering, but if I slip into this, then I experience it as suffering, and I experience the suffering all over again? Well, because your conscious you slipped into a separate self, and now you're experiencing this as suffering. It's like putting on colored glasses. So if I then step outside the self, look at the self, and dissolve the self and the illusion, then I am permanently freed from that particular kind of suffering. There may be other kinds of suffering, but then I can free myself from those as well by using the same process to overcome the selves. And I know I've explained all of this before, but I haven't done it in the context of awakening because, as I said, I wasn't really clear on what do people mean with awakening. And after watching some more videos on it, I realized that many people have had this dramatic shift. As I said, the conscious you steps outside the normal structures you experience. It's like a whole different. It's almost like you experience that your normal way of looking at life is just all an illusion. It's all a lie. It's all unreal. And quite frankly, for a while I was wondering, have I not had an awakening experience? But then when I looked more closely into how most people describe it, I had my first awakening experience when I was 19 or 20 years old, and I was at this Transcendental Meditation teacher training course in Switzerland, where we did all these meditations and stuff on the Vedas. And I had many non-dual experiences there, and I realized this was an awakening because this was really like stepping outside of my normal sense of identity and experiencing I'm more than that. It's just that I never saw that as a permanent state that was the end of suffering, because as soon as I came home from the course and had to deal with everyday life, I realized I was still suffering. I still had my psychology. So I never for a moment thought this was some permanent state. And when I found Ascended Master teachings, I very quickly realized that the path to a permanent change really is a long, gradual path that requires you to consciously look at your psychology. And I started doing that in the early 1990s and basically have been doing it ever since. But you can come, as I've described in several videos, you can come to this shift where you have overcome the selves that were created based on the illusion of separation and the duality consciousness that cause you to see yourself as a separate being. And when you overcome those selves, you're not actually suffering the way most people would define suffering. Because you're not, the effect of these, as I said, there are two kinds of cells we can talk about. There are the cells that are necessary in order for you to take embodiment and interact with the physical body. But then there's the separate selves that are created based on duality, the illusion you're a separate being. And these dualistic selves, In the duality consciousness, there are always two opposite polarities. So the dualistic self is always fighting something. That's why I said they present you with a problem you have to solve, because there is something that opposes your happiness and peace of mind. There's something outside of yourself that causes you to suffer. And you have to change that outside of yourself in order to overcome the suffering. Whereas when you have a real, authentic awakening experience and you realize what it means, you realize, no, I don't have to change anything outside of myself to overcome suffering. I have to change the self, I have to overcome the self in my own mind that causes me to suffer. That is the key to overcoming suffering. And both Killerby and Dixon, they are talking about the scam of non-duality, but it's an unintentional scam. And I don't know these non-dual teachers personally. Perhaps it is that they just haven't grasped what I just explained. Maybe they haven't. So therefore they are not deliberately lying. They were hoping that their awakening experience would be the end of suffering. But the thing is, if you have an experience, no matter how dramatic it is, and it causes you to set yourself up as a teacher, promising other people that if they listen to you and follow your teachings, they will have the same experience, and that experience is the end of suffering, but you are still suffering, then aren't you lying to people? I mean, perhaps you're lying to yourself, because you're not acknowledging that you're suffering, and you're not acknowledging that this means that what you are saying about awakening isn't true, because it isn't the end of suffering, it isn't a permanent change. And perhaps this is because people are caught up in this age-old dynamic of the outer path, thinking that I can be saved, I can go to heaven, I can ascend, I can go into non-dual awareness, I can overcome the self by just having some kind of switch in the mind, instead of going through this long and arduous process. And so what I explain in all of my videos about non-duality and many of my other videos is it just isn't the case. Because the whole purpose of this world of form that we are in is to give us an environment where we can experiment with our free will, with our co-creative abilities. And we do this by creating some kind of structure in the mind, projecting energy and consciousness through that structure upon the basic energy that makes up the universe, and thereby we are co-creating our physical circumstances, as I explained that humankind has created the current state of lack and suffering. And we will not overcome this outer circumstance and the suffering until we acknowledge the fact that it wasn't some laws of nature or an anchor being in the sky that created these outer circumstances, but that we co-created them ourselves through our state of consciousness, and that the only way to overcome the suffering that this has created for us is to look at our consciousness and change the structures so we can project a different image into what I call the cosmic mirror. So to me, that's the importance of an awakening experience. The awakening experience, no matter how dramatic it might seem, is the start of the real process of spiritual growth. It's not the end of it. And if somebody promises you that you can switch your mind and have an instant awakening that ends your suffering, they are lying to you whether they know it or not.